On 4, 9, 13, and 30 March, Turkey was struck by Iranian ballistic missiles in Haiti, Gaziantep, Incirlik Air Base, and within the southeastern Turkish airspace, respectively. All strikes were intercepted by NATO Patriot batteries. Turkey said nothing meaningful, and NATO said less. This silence is what this video is about. What looks like a contained incident on the eastern edge of NATO is something else entirely. It is an unopened front, one with the potential to drag Turkey, Europe, and ultimately Greece into a protracted conflict that has so far been treated as someone else's war. Energy prices and European security are already hanging on the edge of a knife. The question is, what happens when that knife drops? Turkey is not an innocent bystander in the Iran war. It is a key NATO backer that has indirectly facilitated operations against Iranian soil. But the surface explanation, Iran retaliating against a NATO member, does not fully account for the calculation. The deeper interest is structural. Iran wants to destabilize Turkey in the long run to ensure Iranian hegemony across the Middle East before Turkey can consolidate its own. Their interests conflict at almost every pressure point. In Yemen, Iran backs the Houthis while Turkey supports the internationally recognized government. In Sudan, both back the national government against the UAE-backed RSF, a rare alignment that reveals how narrow their common ground actually is. Kurdish insurgency is one of the few areas where their interests genuinely converge, but even there, the overlap is tactical rather than strategic. Turkey, meanwhile, is already stretched. It is managing a proxy conflict in Sudan while facing sustained hyperinflation at home. A war with Iran, even a limited one, could be enough to topple Erdogan. Iran knows this, that vulnerability is not a deterrent to Iranian provocation, it is the point of it. Here is what most analyses of Iran-Turkey tensions miss entirely. This conflict is not only strategic in nature, but it holds a deep eschatological underpinning, and that makes it structural in a way that no diplomatic arrangement can fully resolve. Turkey follows Sunni Islam and has ambitions to become the leader of the Islamic world, positioning itself against Saudi Arabia and, more fundamentally, against Iran. Iran is Shia. Shia doctrine holds that only a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad can be the true successor and legitimate hegemon of Islam. From Tehran's perspective, Ankara's claim to Islamic leadership is not just geopolitically inconvenient, it is doctrinally illegitimate. This is not just theology. It is a civilizational competition for regional leadership that makes the Iran-Turkey conflict structural rather than contingent. Conflict between these middle powers was thus inevitable, though its expression in ballistic missiles and asymmetric warfare are just the current expression of an eschatological battle predating millennia. Iran's calculation about Turkey makes more sense once you understand what Turkey is actually trying to become. Erdogan's Turkey is not Ataturk's Turkey. The secular westward-facing republic has been systematically dismantled in favor of something older and more expansionist, an irredentist Islamic Ottoman project that projects power into Libya, funds proxies in Iraq, Syria, and Sudan, and uses migration as a tool of demographic engineering. The doctrine is called Mavi Vatan, the Blue Homeland. It asserts Turkish sovereignty over vast swaths of the eastern Mediterranean, including waters Greece and Cyprus consider their own. But the maritime claim is only part of it. Turkey has a parallel interest in changing the demographic composition of West Thrace and the eastern Aegean islands through sustained migration, Islamizing them gradually, then using the demographic shift as a pretext for annexation. The strategy mirrors what was applied in northern Cyprus, where mainland Turks were relocated to consolidate Turkish presence permanently. The legal architecture of these claims exists too. Turkey invokes the Misak-ı Milli, the national pact signed by the Ottoman Parliament in January 1920, which claims parts of Iraq, Syria, and western Thrace as historically Turkish territory. Some Turkish maps include Cyprus and the eastern Aegean islands within Turkish borders entirely. This is not fringe politics in Turkey, it is state doctrine. Turkey, despite a poor economy weakened by sustained inflation and collapsing purchasing power, retains enough GDP and domestic defense industry capacity to pose an existential threat to Greece. Greece has no comparable domestic defense base, no meaningful asymmetric warfare capacity, and no economic depth to sustain a protracted conflict. A paradigm for what this could look like already exists in Ukraine. Ukraine adopted US shock and awe doctrine under effective NATO guidance, using conventional decapitation strategies modeled on the Iraq War. Russia, on the offensive, struggled to advance through the Donbass toward Odessa, but successfully absorbed Ukrainian long-range strikes and repelled counteroffensives despite significant vulnerabilities. The lesson is not that the larger power always wins, it is that a smaller power fighting with borrowed doctrine against an adversary with domestic industry and asymmetric capability tends to become a pawn rather than a protagonist. Greece risks exactly this. Without a centralized command structure adapted to its actual geography, relying on state shock and awe doctrines against an adversary with domestic missile production, drone warfare capacity, and a long-term strategic vision, Greece could find itself in Kiev's position, dependent, reactive, and unable to dictate the terms of its own defense. For Turkey to act, the conditions would need to align. A Turkish economy stable enough to absorb the costs, and a Western alliance internally fractured, militarily overextended, and financially exhausted enough that the window stays open long enough for a brief expansionary movement in the eastern Aegean and West Thrace. Western Thrace has no meaningful land defenses until the mountains of central Macedonia. Turkey could additionally use Fyrom and Albania to stage destabilizing operations targeting Greek logistics and communications before a shot is officially fired. The only historical counter-argument is the determination of the Greek people. Italy invaded Greece in 1940 with what appeared to be superior military and failed. But Italy is 2.3 times the size of Greece. Turkey is approximately 6 times the size compared to Greece. That disparity matters. If Greece is to survive a conflict with Turkey rather than merely endure it, the model is not NATO doctrine, it is Israel. Israel built its military strategy around one core principle: strike before being struck and make every conflict too costly to continue. In the 1967 Six-Day War, preemptive air raids destroyed Egypt's air force on the ground before a single Egyptian offensive operation could begin. Air superiority established in hours, Egyptian forces in the Sinai encircled and dissolved within days. In 1973, the calculus was tested in reverse. Egypt and Syria invaded simultaneously and gained substantial early victories. Israel's response was not to wait for NATO. Israel mobilized 300,000 men within 72 hours, rapidly rebuilt lost equipment, adapted its tactics from armored warfare to combined artillery and infantry, seized the Golan Heights, crossed the Suez Canal, and forced a ceasefire on favorable terms. The lesson is not that Israel always wins, it is that Israel built the domestic capacity, industrial intelligence, doctrinal, etc., to improve under pressure in ways that imported equipment and borrowed doctrine cannot replicate. Greece is currently doing the opposite, buying Rafales and F-35s, the same aircraft Turkey is also acquiring, in a mirror image arms race managed by major powers with interest in keeping both sides dependent. This is strategic insanity. Parity purchased from the same supplier is not an advantage, it is expensive stasis. That preemptive instinct, striking before being struck, is exactly what shapes Iranian calculations toward Turkey today, and it also explains what the US is doing inside Iran's borders right now. To understand it, it helps to look at a historical precedent most people have forgotten. In 1950s Malaysia, the British faced a communist insurgency drawing its support from the rural Chinese population. Their solution was to forcibly relocate that population into fortified settlements called new villages, physically separating the insurgency from the civilian base that sustained it, cut off the water and the fish dyes. The strategy worked. Donald Rumsfeld picked up this language after 9/11, talking about the draining of the swamp of terrorist support. His use of the term was controversial precisely because it implied that civilian populations themselves were the target. The strategy has a long and brutal history, and the US applied a version of it in Vietnam through strategic hamlets. Saddam Hussein applied it against the Kurds. What the US appears to be doing in Iran inverts the doctrine entirely. Instead of draining a swamp to suppress an insurgency, it is creating one, funding ethnic minorities in Iran's borderlands to generate internal rebellions that force the Iranian military to unshield itself and fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Balochis in the southeast, the Arabs in the oil-rich Khuzestan, the Azerbaijanis in the northwest, the Kurds on the Iraqi border. Iran's military is currently dispersed and concealed in the mountains. By forcing it to respond to insurgencies across 4 frontier regions, the US creates the conditions for its air force to engage exposed Iranian forces directly. This is Iran's own asymmetric playbook turned against it. Iran built its regional influence through proxies, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, projecting power without committing its own forces. The mirror image is now being applied to Iran's interior. The US strategy in Iran rests on 2 pillars: demographic destabilization through proxy insurgency, and air superiority over the forces drawn out to suppress it. The conditions for broader escalation are already visible. Israeli drone operating from Azerbaijan airspace into Iranian territory, combined with Kurdish insurgent activity on Iran's western border, these are not accidents. They are the opening moves of a strategy with a clear internal logic. All of this, the Iranian strikes on Turkey, the Ottoman revival doctrine, the US strategy in Iran's borderlands, the insurgency corridors opening across 4 frontier regions, has a geography, and that geography points west. Greece sits at the edge of it all. The closest EU member state to West Asia, the most exposed to Iranian reach after Turkey and Cyprus, and the most vulnerable to Turkish opportunism the moment the West looks away. The Strait of Hormuz is blockaded. European energy costs are climbing. Trump is threatening Iran with language that suggests the diplomatic window is narrowing fast. The pieces are moving. The chain connecting Greece to the conflict exists. Finding it and understanding what it means for Greece's survival is what comes next.